Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed and welcome to the first video from my new house. For those that have been following the channel particularly closely in the past few weeks, you'll have heard about how I was moving, things slowly disappearing from the set behind me, and now everything is gone because I've just rebuilt the wall in the new place, and you'll see some shelves and other interesting things go back up there in the coming weeks. Bit of a project, so if you are interested, there are some behind the scenes videos available for our Patreons on that whole process. The audio in here at the moment as well isn't particularly great. It is a little bit echoey. I still have to put up some acoustic foam all around the other side of the set area. So that'll be happening in the coming weeks as well. And hopefully we'll be able to improve the sound quality a little bit to bring it back to where it was at the previous place. So yeah, a bit still to do on the audio front. Hopefully it's not too bad. I'll do some things in post, hopefully make it not as bad as it sounds in here at the moment. And yeah, set should be coming up nicely in the next couple of weeks. Anyway, this video isn't about moving house. It's about a particularly interesting monitor that Acer sent over, the Nitro XV273K. This is a gaming monitor that many of you have been requesting that I review, in particular one of our Patreon members who made sure I was following this up with Acer every few weeks. Anyway, after months of waiting, the XV273K landed on my doorstep and I've been able to put it through its paces. This monitor is particularly interesting because it's the first to bring a 4K resolution and 144Hz refresh rate to gamers at a more affordable price point than existing offerings. You might remember my reviews of the Acer Predator X27 and Asus ROG Swift PG27UQ. Those were the first monitors ever to pack this combination of a high resolution and high refresh rate. But because they also included proper HDR support and G-Sync Ultimate, they were priced well out of reach of many buyers at around that $2,000 mark. But the XV273K is much cheaper, often retailing for around $900. I wouldn't call this super affordable by any means, but at half the cost of the original high refresh 4K monitors, it could be tempting to some high-end buyers. Of course, with any cheaper product, some features have been cut to bring the price down. The big omission here is the FALD, or Full Array Local Dimming backlight, that was found in the Predator X27. The FALD backlight is important because it brings proper HDR to the table, so with that feature cut from the XV273K, we're no longer getting true HDR capabilities. It is still Display HDR 400 certified, but that validation stamp is pretty much meaningless. G-Sync has also been cut in favor of FreeSync, but now that Nvidia also supports FreeSync, that's no longer a really big deal, and as expected, Adaptive Sync worked fine with my Nvidia GPU. In fact, this monitor is G-Sync compatible, so the Nvidia control panel automatically detects it as an Adaptive Sync monitor and applies the appropriate settings for you. Acer has given this monitor a definite gamer aesthetic, but they haven't gone overboard. The stand uses silver metal prongs and there's a bit of flair to the base with a red highlight, but otherwise we're getting a standard black plastic construction. It's not a particularly slim monitor, it's perhaps slightly thinner than the X27 as there's no FALD backlight, but you'll mostly be viewing it from the front where the bezels are moderate, if a little larger than normal. As for other elements, we get a little bit of RGB LED action along the bottom edge, but it thankfully can be disabled. The stand is height, tilt and swivel adjustable, but there's no pivot motion, so you can't use it in a portrait orientation. Overall, the stand is very sturdy, so that's great to see. There's also no active cooling fan, so the monitor is silent, unlike the two G-Sync Ultimate monitors I mentioned earlier. For ports, there's two HDMI ports and two display ports, plus some classic USB hub action. The monitor requires an external power brick as well. Then for the on-screen menu, we do get a directional toggle, so that's a tick in my book, plus a few shortcut buttons. Unfortunately, the OSD is quite sluggish to navigate. The performance here is surprisingly poor, which isn't something I often find about these menus. What you will find in the menu though are some neat features, including a black frame insertion mode for increased clarity. I personally never use this mode, but I know some people do find it useful. There's also a low blue light mode, a mode that uses the ambient light sensor to automatically adjust settings, a few cheat crosshairs and some other typical stuff. Ace has a pretty good feature set here. Moving into the performance section, there are a few refresh rate oddities I want to talk about first. While this panel is capable of a 144Hz refresh rate, enabling it is hidden away in the on-screen menu. On top of that, to use the mode, you'll need to run dual DisplayPort cables, which introduces its own set of compatibility challenges. But worst of all is the fact that enabling the 144Hz refresh rate disables FreeSync. Not an ideal situation for gamers that benefit greatly from adaptive sync with such a high resolution. There are some workarounds that buyers have discovered, but they are pretty complicated, and to be honest, the difference between 120 and 144Hz isn't large enough to warrant the effort. It is a bit annoying that a product marketed as supporting 144Hz is either compromised at that refresh rate or requires a lot of effort to get working properly, but at least it's quite easy to get 120Hz working through a single cable. With all of that said, I can understand what Acer has tried to do here. By supporting 144Hz through dual DisplayPort rather than a single cable like with the Predator X27, the monitor is capable of running at that refresh rate with 10-bit color for HDR without chroma subsampling. So if you want to run at that refresh, the image is clearer than with the equivalent G-Sync Ultimate displays, albeit without adaptive sync in most cases. Unfortunately, you will be stuck with chroma subsampling if you want to run at a 120Hz refresh rate over a single cable and use HDR at the same time. The SDR mode is fine, but for HDR viewing over a single cable with native RGB, you'll need to drop down to just 60Hz as there's no optimal 98Hz mode that makes the most use of DisplayPort's bandwidth, so that's another minor annoyance. When taking into account all of this refresh rate and cable talk, my recommendation is simply to run at 120Hz in the SDR mode over a single DisplayPort cable. It's nice and simple, you'll retain adaptive sync, the difference between 120 and 144Hz is small, and this monitor's HDR mode really isn't good enough to bother using it and fluffing around with chroma subsampling. The other reason to stick to 120Hz is in the response times. The monitor comes with two overdrive modes, normal and extreme. However, the extreme mode introduces overshoot with many transitions. I recommend using the normal mode as a result, but with a greater gray average response time of 7.52 milliseconds in this mode, the display is effectively being bottlenecked to around 120Hz, which means there isn't much to be gained from jumping up to 144Hz anyway. This response time result also puts the XV273K below both the Asus PG27UQ and Acer X27 in the charts despite having similar panels. The Asus model still leads here with the best overdrive optimization. I wouldn't say the XV273K is bad by any stretch and it's fine for 120Hz, but at the same time it's really nothing special. On the other hand, input latency is great at around 3 milliseconds of lag, which is an ideal result for a gaming monitor. Alright, let's move on to some brightness and contrast numbers. In the SDR mode, we're getting around 430 in its peak, which is more than enough for most viewers. And when combined with great viewing angles, particularly in the horizontal plane, this is a highly viewable monitor. As for contrast, yeah, it's typical for an IPS at around that 1000 to 1 mark. You aren't going to get VA-like numbers here, but it's still decent enough. For gaming monitors, I tend to treat color accuracy as a nice bonus, but considering this display is nearing that $1,000 mark, it's probably a bit more important than usual. Luckily, Acer does provide a sheet claiming factory calibration to a Delta E average of less than 1.0, and the monitor comes with a number of color modes for popular gamuts like sRGB, Rec 709, and DCI. We'll just quickly run through the default out-of-the-box performance here, nothing amazing, and I don't imagine too many people will run the monitor in this mode. As expected, the gamut is fully unclamped, so we're getting the entire 91% DCI P3 coverage this monitor is capable of, even for sRGB content, which does mean oversaturation. There's also an incorrect white point, and generally Delta E averages are above 4.0, which really is not accurate for sRGB work. Switching to the sRGB mode, and things do improve, but perhaps not to the level I would have liked. Like with the default mode, the monitor still has a slight red tint to grays, which is noticeable when putting the monitor next to properly calibrated displays. This behavior was a little unusual given the supposed factory calibration, and it isn't quite close enough to the ideal white point to get my tick of approval. Grayscale Delta E averages are still around that 4.0 mark as a result. However, with our saturation testing, you can quite clearly see the gamut is fully clamped to sRGB, which is good for most content you'll be viewing. Delta E averages for some colors are better than others, but it evens out to around 2.5. Not perfect, not the 1.0 Acer claims, but for gamers I think this result is close enough. And this carries through to the ColorChecker tests, which are pretty similar. It's a similar story for the DCI mode, so I'm not going to talk about that in detail, but if you do need a wide gamut mode, it is one to consider. Unfortunately, fixing the incorrect white point does require a software profile. If you find that your monitor is tinted slightly red, it might be worth checking out the profile I generated for my review unit, which is available on our Patreon feed. Due to panel variants, I don't think every monitor will ship with a red tint, so it may not help out in your specific situation. When calibrated using DisplayCal, you can see the results here, which as always are quite good with Delta E averages around the 1.0 mark. This combination of the sRGB mode and a software profile would be fine for creators, especially as the monitor uses IPS technology with great viewing angles and decent wide gamut performance. I'll touch quickly on uniformity here, nothing amazing, nothing overly poor, a typical result for a gaming grade monitor. The results I got from the Acer Predator X27 in uniformity and color performance in general are better than what this panel provides. Perhaps there's a higher level of factory calibration occurring there for what is a $2,000 display. HDR really isn't worth touching on in any great detail because we're looking at another fake HDR display. With only Display HDR 400 certification, the XV273K fails 2 of the 3 key metrics for good HDR performance. Namely, brightness is too low as it fails to hit 600 nits peak, and there's no local dimming, so the contrast ratio stays fixed at around 1000 to 1, which is far too low for HDR content. I wouldn't buy this monitor for HDR, and I wouldn't bother using the mode altogether. All up, this is one of those monitors that's in a unique position because there isn't a lot like it on the market. Sure, you have those super expensive G-Sync HDR panels that cost $2,000, but if you don't care about HDR and just want a high refresh 4K monitor, it's basically the XV273K, its G-Sync brother, the XB273K, that's essentially the same and costs a little more, or, well, nothing. If high refresh 4K is what you want, the XV273K is definitely the monitor you should get. I really don't think proper HDR is worth spending an additional $750 on, going on current market prices, considering this display is a relatively cheap $900 and offers nearly every other feature that the Predator X27 offers. It is much better value. And I'm not saying that just because this is the only monitor available with these specs. In a number of areas, Acer is providing a great high-end gaming experience. The build quality is great, the IPS panel puts up respectable performance numbers, including a true 120Hz refresh rate, the included sRGB mode is great for standard gaming, and you get wide gamut support on top of that. Plus it supports FreeSync and comes G-Sync compatible certified. It's not perfect though. My main concern still surrounds that top end 144Hz refresh rate, which isn't as usable as I'd like. I think 120Hz is going to be plenty high enough for buyers, and that refresh rate still delivers a great fluid experience, but it is advertised as 144Hz, so that mode should be a bit better in my opinion. The other complaints I had were less important, like the slow on-screen menu and a few inconsistencies with the calibration, plus a worthless HDR mode. While I would recommend the XV273K for people who want a high refresh 4K monitor right now, I still think we're in the early adopter phase for these sorts of monitors. The issues getting that 144Hz mode to work well are largely technical limitations that should be solved with future iterations, and I also expect the price to trickle down over time. $900 is still a lot to spend on a monitor, particularly when high refresh 1440p is available at less than half the price, and for most gamers, in my opinion, is still a better choice. That's it for this review of the Acer Nitro XV273K. You can find links to the monitors I've discussed throughout this review in the description below. Consider subscribing for more monitor content. Check us out on Patreon for some cool perks and those behind the scenes videos of my moving process around here, and I'll catch you in the next one.